to talk about Autofac and something I kind of learned about this past week that I thought was pretty cool. So I'm going to start by talking about what Autofac is, why you might want to use it, how I've been using it, and then kind of what I was able to learn in this past week through a project I've been working on. So um, the idea is that when you're using the composition and sort of passing in classes into other classes, um, when you keep following this chain at some point in your application, like at the beginning of your application, if everything is taken to this extreme, you kind of have this one spot in your application where um, you create all of your objects and kind of pass them into each other so that your whole dependency tree is built up. So it's a lot of work all in one spot, and the really cool feels like magic that it can link in all the pieces that you might need. So I'll kind of give you an example of that. So I have a Xamarin app here, and I'm going to jump to the main activity. Let's see here. So what you're able to do. So it's kind of weird if you're not used to Xamarin, and this is what we're looking at here is sort of the Android, you would call like the Android entry point, so the onCreate method for a Android activity called main. And what we're able to do, and I'm going to kind of dive into each of these pieces, is that we can do something called creating a scope, which is going to be the lifetime scope of all of the objects that we want Autofac to take care of. We're going to resolve the application class, and then this load application is a method that's built into Xamarin for Android. So what is, kind of what's going on here? So we'll dive into create scope. And I made my own thing here called Dependency Factory, and I'll jump into that right now just so we can kind of see the Autofac pieces. Um, so Autofac is essentially it uses something called like a dependency container. So you start by making a container builder, and what you're able to do, or what I like to do at least, is I register all of what you call a module for the current assembly that we're in. So what's a module? Well, I'll give you an example of one, and I'm going to jump over to this spot here. So I have something called a controllers module for my application, and essentially what it lets you do is you can register all these types, and a nice thing that you're able to do is you can say like, I want to register this type. Yeah, you can do things like say call it like a singleton. So anytime someone asks for one of these things, you're always getting the same instance back. You can make it so that you can only resolve it by certain interfaces and other really cool things. These ones I have are all controllers, and this is going to be. I'm going to circle back to this because this is really the um, one of the core problems that I was overcoming. But I have these things called controllers, and they have this thing called auto activate as self. And the reason why is that with Autofac, I'll jump back to this main activity here to explain it. But what we wanted to do was resolve this application. When you first try to resolve an object like the application, it will say, okay, well, what were the sort of the dependencies that application needs. So I'm going to jump to that. And then it says, well, if I make a new app, I need a new iMain view. So what Autofac is able to do is say, okay, well, who registered themselves as an iMain view? And then it finds that class. Then it says, okay, well, what does this class need? And then it kind of keeps this chain of events going. So the first time you resolve something like an application level object, it fires off this really big chain of events that, in theory, should go pretty fast, right? If you had all these really simple classes, like a constructor should run really fast. But when you start linking in like third-party libraries, you might have something where it's like, okay, well, I want to register like an Android notification system, and just constructing that object in a third-party library might actually do some heavier lifting. We're not talking like minutes or anything. We're talking, maybe hundreds of milliseconds, which for a constructor is a very long time. And when you start having all these pieces get linked up together, suddenly your startup time can get pretty big. And again, pretty big, meaning seconds, not not like minutes or anything like that. Um, so that's sort of the idea, and Autofac is able to kind of do that for you. So as long as well, I'll jump to a specific example of a controller class that I have to give you an example. So the reason why the controllers I'm jumping around all over, sorry, but in one of the in this module, all these controllers are auto activate as self, and the reason why is because I mentioned that in the entry point we wanted to resolve an application so we can use it. I have these controllers which it's going to sound kind of weird, but nothing depends on them. So I need them to start up because when they're created, they listen and they hook up to different events, and then they can control things that way. But no one has a dependency on the controllers. So if I don't ever auto activate them, nothing ever creates them. So now to jump to a specific example of what I mean, I'm going to highlight this block of code here. So when this home controller is created, it listens to a bunch of these different events here that I have highlighted. And what happens is that once this is created, it wires these event handlers up so that when people are interacting with different screens, I have all of this code behind that can listen to these events. But nothing actually is interested in a home controller. So there's no spot in the code that says, okay, like go resolve me the home controller, and then this will get created. I have to explicitly say, like, no one's interested in this thing, but I know it needs to be created, which is why we use the auto activate thing. So one of the challenges, though, is that because of this paradigm I have with these controllers, I have a whole bunch of these auto activate as self pieces. So this is one of the challenges that we're going to try to overcome, which is that I'm basically saying that as soon as the container is built to start resolving things from, right when that happens, actually go create all of these instances. But the crazy thing about these controllers is that they take in a bunch of different parameters, right? And because they take in a bunch of different parameters, like the example I gave earlier, all of these things Autofac has to go resolve. So I'll give you, I'm just going to pick like iNavigation service. Okay, so what does, so home controller is going to need one of these, but what is this thing? Okay, so here's a navigation service, and you can see, well, it takes in iMainView and iEventTracker. Okay, so then you keep going up this chain. So iMainView, I'm just going to jump into this. So it needs to take one of these, and then you keep having this ever-growing chain of dependencies, right? So the challenge with having these controllers get auto-activated is that they essentially force a large portion of my application to have to go get resolved as soon as the container is built. And like I mentioned, if all the constructors were really, really short, we wouldn't notice anything. But they, over time, start to grow and take up, the resolution time starts to increase to seconds in my case. And I'm going to kind of illustrate that. So that's one challenge. And then the other challenge is one of the first things I kind of pointed out, which is when we resolve the application itself, it wants to start getting all these other dependencies. So even if I didn't have these controllers, the application root object starts to have a lot of these similar dependencies anyway. So it slows down the startup of the application. And what the user experiences is because this happens on the main thread, for the Android application and the iOS application, it kind of just looks like your app's frozen, you don't really see anything, and then all of a sudden everything kind of shows up, which is kind of crappy user experience. And right now the app isn't very big, so this is something I wanted to address early so that as we continue to add more features, that the the startup time doesn't continue to feel like, you click the app and you're waiting like, 30 seconds or something for it to pop up. I mean, ideally I can reduce the overall startup time, but I don't want the experience to feel really bad. So what did we do to make this better? So I'll start by talking about something that I was aware of with Autofac, which is really cool, and that I didn't know that it did more of this. So as an example, I'm gonna mess this one up just to illustrate something. But if we pretend that I had many different can't speak, sorry, many different implementations. There we go, of an iLogin navigator. If you wanted Autofac to give you all of them, all you don't need to like. What you don't need to do is like, do this, um, pass them all in, or have like all these special interfaces. I'm just gonna like you don't need to do something like this if you had a bunch of different variations of them. You can do this really cool thing. Oops. You can put an IEnumerable of them, okay, and then Autofac will go say, for all of the iLogin Navigator implementations I have registered, here's all of them. And you don't have to use IEnumerable. You can use iCollection. Kind of, it's whatever you want. Well, not whatever. I think IEnumerable, iCollection, maybe list as well. But it's a pretty powerful way that you can kind of get a whole set of these things. But something else that Autofac can do, which I didn't know about, is it can actually use the lazy object. So this is a really cool thing because what lazy does is that it doesn't actually okay, well, it's a weird thing to explain. So if you had lazy iLogin navigator, it doesn't actually make a login navigator for you until you ask for the value of it, if that makes sense. So I'm going to undo that, and I'm just going to make up something else here. So if I wanted to do like lazy, I'm just going to do lazy object, call it lazy example. So if I wanted to do this lazy, you have to basically say on your lazy object you ask for the value, and the first time that you ask for dot value, it will actually go resolve it. So just to show you how, if you wanted to make your own like lazy thing without Autofac, you might do like lazy, and you pass in, where's my IntelliSense here? You give it like a method to run, right? So let's get rid of this. I'm just going to take off this parameter because it's not really going to help for our example here. So if you look at this code that I have written here, when you make a new lazy object, this code doesn't run until the very first time that you call dot value. The next time you call dot value, it's already sort of cached the return result of this. So it runs it only once, and it's only the first time you ask for dot value. So it actually delays, and this is the powerful part, it delays this block of code that I have highlighted. It delays that until you call dot value. And Autofac's actually able to do that so that I mentioned if I have something like a home controller and I go to resolve it or to auto activate it, it then wants to go resolve all of these. Well, that's crappy because it's going to go do all that work all at once. And if we look in here, really, if you ignore this method just for now, I only need a true reference to a home view model, user manager, and an OAuth manager. I need these objects here right away so that I can hook up to them. But all these other things that I have passed in, I don't actually need them yet. I don't need the real reference yet. I can delay that until the first time I go use that. So this is the idea behind like delaying the resolution until we actually go need it, which is going to save us some startup time. So the first thing I did was I found this spot in this controllers module. So I've already kind of reverted some of the code so I could show you in this video, but I had all this auto activate as self stuff going on. And what I did was I said, well, I'm going to implement a interface called iController, and all of these controllers, I'm just going to say like register them um, as an iController, and someone else at some point in time is going to be responsible for resolving all of these. Um, and where did I put that now? um, there. Okay, so if you'll notice, I talked about lazy, right? I actually combined, and this is something Autofac does out of the box, which is really cool. I have this lazy collection of controllers. So what does that mean? So um, I've already kind of talked about what Autofac does with lazy and what Autofac does with an collection. So the really cool thing here is that when Autofac creates this reference for us, this startup object that I've created, what it's able to do is give us a collection of all of the controllers, but it won't actually go resolve them until we ask for the value. Right? So basically, I don't want to say this happens instantly, but when Autofac sees this, it goes, well, I don't need to go make all the controllers right now. I can give you a delayed like resolution of all of the controllers. And when I say all the controllers, I mean collection of controllers. I can give you a delayed resolution of that, which is awesome because now all of my controllers, instead of taking all that startup time right at construction, right, because auto activate as self would mean as soon as the container is ready, the dependency container, all the controllers go get built, which means basically almost all of the objects in my my application get built. We don't want that. So this delays it for us, which is really cool. I've kind of wrapped it up in some other stuff, like I have this only once thing here, but all that that's doing, just to make this more clear, all that that code is doing is, oops, lazy controllers. It's just calling lazy controllers dot value. That's it. That's all it's doing. And by doing that, Autofac goes, oh, I need to go resolve all these controllers, right? But I've delayed it until some point in time when I call startup async. So now instead of happening all when my my application's created, I can say, don't go make all these controllers yet. Only make them when I say to, which is really powerful for us because we can put that, what I wanted to do is put it behind a splash screen. So instead of the application starting up and you're kind of waiting and being like, you know, it's only seconds, but still it kind of sucks. You're waiting there being like, well, you know, I click the app icon, like, why isn't it popping up? And then all of a sudden everything's there. It pops up sooner. And then you get sort of a little splash screen where you wait. So it didn't reduce the overall time. It just improves the experience. And the reason why is because I can say only go resolve these once I put a splash screen up, so that make the user wait once it doesn't feel once it feels like there's some sort of like progress indicator, that kind of thing. So that was a really powerful thing for the controllers. That might have been kind of hard to follow, especially if you haven't used Autofac before. But for me, like, you can see all these other things are passing as lazy because these were things that also took some time to start up. So I have this. This one's actually kind of cool. So I have this lazy. I called it iSplashWork. So in Xamarin, pardon me. At least for us, we have an Android app and an iOS application. And each of those has some platform-specific startup code. On Android, I found that the startup code specific to that platform was taking about a second. And a second's not really a long period of time, but like I mentioned, that's probably going to keep increasing because of more dependencies being added. It's just time where the user doesn't, they're not really getting that feedback of like, I'm starting the app, why isn't it here? So it's a whole second for now of work that I was able to defer. And for our use case, that was things like setting up the background push notifications. I think that was mostly, and a couple of like third-party libraries for analytics and things like that. So you can see this lazy splash work thing. I have the instance variable up here, and it's the first thing we do in this set of background work. But again, it's not during construction time. I've deferred it into a point in time where I have the splash screen up at least, which is pretty cool. So that was the mechanism that I started to use. And so controllers are one big part of it. This application specific logic was one big part of it. And just to kind of show you what that looked like, let's find the Android splash work here. So all this code, and it doesn't look like too much. All this code was in the Android application entry point. But that's like registering all of the authentication handlers. That's registering push notifications, which is also asking the device for a cloud messaging token. And then this is like sort of like crash reporting. So it starts to do all this stuff on startup, which it was the right spot to put it. But for us now, like we want to defer that until we have a splash screen up. So all of this work that you see here, I'm just going to jump back. All that work is now called basically right here in this line. And that's because I can ask Autofac to give me a delayed resolution of that class. And then we can call it when we put the splash screen up. So that all sort of makes sense in theory. So what did I do to get a splash screen up? So I'm going to jump to our main page here. You'll notice that I have a combination of some things are lazy and some things aren't. So our main view model, I had to do a bit of like digging around to see like what dependencies we could work with, because it doesn't make sense to make them lazy if I have to resolve them right away in the constructor anyway. So what I mean by that is, well, I'm going to double click view model so it highlights it. You can see it's used right here in the constructor. So if I did, and then the first thing I do is this, it didn't offer any benefit. And the reason why is because like I'm basically forcing the resolution right away anyway, right? It happens. It's not before this thing was constructed and passed in. It's actually like it happens still in the constructor. So we don't even have the reference to the object yet anyway. So there's no benefit to making these things lazy. But if I pick, I'm just going to backspace that. I have the startup class we were just looking at, right? So I'm going to jump back. It's this thing that we were just looking at. Because if I didn't delay the resolution of that, I mean, these are lazy anyway, so that's nice. This hangry startup thing, I wanted to put this up once I had a splash screen up. So if I highlight this, you can see the only spot it's used is in this callback here. It's not actually, I'm pointing on my screen with my finger, so it's not really helping anyone. I'm going to highlight, there we go. This hangry startup object is used. The application is called Hangry, by the way, in case that wasn't obvious. I just realized I probably said it a few times now, or you've seen it on screen. The application is Hangry, but this reference here isn't actually used until later. So if I look at delayed Hangry startup, where we use that, I'm going to collapse some of this code so it's easier to read. But when this view appears, I'm going to go run this thing asynchronously. And when I go run that asynchronously, scrolling all the way back to the top here, then it's going to start resolving stuff. So what I was able to do was say, okay, instead of trying to get this, the difference is like when this application used to show up, you get the main page and everything would be populated, but you would have to wait an extra long period of time for everything that main page needed to show you, which is essentially the whole application had to go get resolved. Now what I'm able to do is I can give you the main page, and then if we look at the things that aren't lazy, I have a view model for it, And spoiler alert, this view model has basically nothing in it. So that's really fast for us to get a reference to. A splash screen. And I didn't make that lazy because I want that splash screen. I need to show it right away, right? You can see. So a master detail page is like, I don't know the best way to explain. It's going to be tricky to explain with my hands and stuff, and not running an emulator because the emulator is really slow on my computer, so I can't show you what it looks like. But basically, I needed to put the main, what you're going to see on screen is a splash screen right away, and I have a slide out menu that we need to be able to access right away as well. So these things could not be lazy, or they could be lazy, but like I mentioned earlier, zero benefit to it. And then everything else we can delay. So basically the way this code reads is that we set a menu and we set sort of a splash screen right away for you, right? So the user sees that as soon as the app comes up. Then while the splash screen is up, then I go start resolving the rest of the application, which is really cool. And then when that's all done, there's this other method here, and it says invoke on main thread. So that's where once we're done all the asynchronous stuff for the splash screen work, then I'm going to actually, all this code does is kind of gets rid of the splash screen and puts like our home page up. So hopefully that kind of made sense. So again, big difference is that all of these things that are marked as lazy up here, I don't need Autofac to go make them ahead of time for me. I can delay the resolution, which takes time. I can delay the resolution of those things until I actually need them. So that means I can put a splash screen up, I can do some background work, and the experience is way better for the user. So I think that's mostly it. I did want to show, I wanted to kind of show on my phone. It's going to be kind of hard to get it up on the webcam. But maybe I can do that. So can I make this bigger? Boom, there we go. That's my face, sorry. I'm just going to try this quickly. Yeah, so I can probably flip this around pretty quick. But what you're going to see right away is that there is still a white screen. Like I have to do a bit more digging to see like what other things Xamarin's doing. If there's debug settings that actually make the startup time a little bit slower. So there's still a white screen, but hopefully I can flip the phone fast enough around for you so you can see the splash screen. And what you should hopefully be able to understand from all this is that the time that you see the splash screen, that's actually time that previously users wouldn't see anything, or they'd see the white screen for even longer and be like, well, why am I waiting? And it's about 1 to 2 seconds. So that's my phone. I'm going to try to. Right. So what you could see is while that little spinner was going, I'll do it again. While that spinner was going, that was actually just dead time before. So white screen, spinner. Right. So because we were able to use lazy with Autofac, I could defer all of that extra work until I put the splash screen up. And like I said before, without the splash screen, you get that white screen. And you're like, well, what's going on? Like, this kind of sucks. And I can only imagine that's going to get slower as we add more things in. So, like we don't have ads or anything like that. And I'm assuming if we put an ad SDK in, that's going to have some extra communication with external servers to reach out to be able to fetch the ads, sort of configure your API keys and things like that. So when that happens, that's extra load time. We don't want that to happen while the user has a white screen. We'd want that while the splash screen is up. So for me, reflecting on this, what I learned with sort of the lazy combination with Autofac, when I was building desktop applications, we already had a splash screen. So I never really had to think about this because we had the splash screen up and we could just say, go resolve all the things by the time we were building the container. Because I was able to put Autofac in from the start of this application, it meant that as soon as I was building it, I was already set up to experience this delay. So yeah, it's one of those things like if you already have a splash screen and you're not resolving a dependency container until you have the splash screen up, this might not really benefit you. Maybe it might benefit you if you know that you're not going to have to resolve certain things until way later in your application lifecycle. That could be hugely beneficial, I guess. Um, for me, for me, I needed those controllers to be resolved pretty early on in the application lifecycle. So essentially, once the splash screen goes away, I need those controllers to be there because they hook up to all the button presses and things like that. But maybe you have an application and like there's some workflow that gets really cumbersome with in terms of creating objects and things like that, and you don't need to do that until the user actually navigates to that part of the application. Well, great, lazy can work for you in that case because you can save all your startup time and defer that to way later. Maybe it's something that the user they never even like it's an optional workflow. They never have to navigate to it. So why make them wait that extra startup time to resolve those objects if they're never even going to use it? Like I said, for me, I need those controllers to be resolved because once you're on the home screen and you say like you want to start a session or join a session or do any work in the application, I need those controllers resolved. So for me there was no way around it. But you might have instances where you're like, I don't need all those objects created right now. You want your code to be able to have those access to those dependencies, but you might not need the actual concrete references until later in the app. So yeah, I mean I think that's all for today. But yeah, I just wanted to be able to share that because I've been using Autofac for a few years now and I didn't even know